The sirens echoed through Ouagadougou that night. Families shut their doors. Mothers pulled their children close. And in the distance, armored vehicles rolled through the streets. The city had seen unrest before, but never anything like this. At the heart of this storm stood a young man who had already shaken the foundations of West Africa. Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso. His decision that night would change not only the future of his country, but perhaps the entire Sahel region. For more than 50 years, foreign mining companies dug deep into the soil of Burkina Faso, extracting gold worth billions, while the average family struggled to afford food and basic security. The people watched as foreign executives lived in luxury, protected by private guards, while local miners risked their lives in unstable pits. One widow recalled how her husband was buried alive in a collapsed mine shaft, leaving her with 5 children and no support. She said, "They took everything from him and from us. All we had was his labor, and even that killed him." That widow's voice represents countless families who suffered while others grew rich. Then, in a single coordinated move, Traoré ordered the arrest of several senior executives of these foreign mining corporations. In broad daylight, men once untouchable were escorted in handcuffs. The images spread across Africa within hours. For the people of Burkina Faso, it felt like justice had finally arrived. For the companies, it was an earthquake that shook their power. But the question remains, was this a brave step toward independence and dignity, or a dangerous gamble that could plunge Burkina Faso into greater instability? Could one young leader really dismantle decades of exploitation without triggering retaliation from powerful nations and corporations? For a man in his 30s to confront an entire international system seemed almost unthinkable. And yet, it was happening. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look at what Burkina Faso represents. It is a small country, landlocked in West Africa, with a population of just over 22 million. And yet, it sits on some of the richest gold deposits in the world. That gold has financed everything from skyscrapers in foreign capitals to private villas along the French Riviera. But for Burkina Faso itself, it financed almost nothing. Roads remain unpaved, hospitals under-equipped, and young men often forced into migration just to survive. This is not just another African story. For many Americans, especially those who remember the Cold War and the long battles for freedom across the globe, this is a story about power, justice, and whether a small nation can stand against giants. What happens in Burkina Faso will not stay there. It could reshape alliances, security, and America's own fight against terrorism in the Sahel. So tonight, as we examine what Ibrahim Traoré has done, we must ask ourselves, is he the hope of a new Africa, or a spark that may ignite greater chaos? For the people who filled the streets of Ouagadougou waving flags and chanting his name, he is already a hero. For others, especially in boardrooms thousands of miles away, he is a threat that must be stopped. If you believe that justice should never be silenced, if you believe that the dignity of a people is worth more than corporate profit, then stay with us. This story is not just about Africa. It is about all of us. Because when one nation demands fairness, it reminds the world that power must answer to justice. And so the question stands, Ibrahim Traoré, savior or risk? Leader of liberation or gambler with his nation's fate? The sirens in Ouagadougou are still ringing in our ears, and the answer is far from clear. But what exactly happened on that night when the impossible became reality? The morning after the sirens, Burkina Faso woke up to headlines that seemed impossible. Multiple executives from foreign mining companies had been detained in a nationwide operation. These men were not just businessmen, they were the power brokers who, for decades, dictated the terms of Burkina Faso's most valuable resource, gold. To many, their sudden arrest felt like the ground beneath the old order had cracked. The operation was meticulously planned. Around 2,000 soldiers and police officers were deployed across Ouagadougou and several mining provinces. In the capital, convoys surrounded luxury compounds where executives lived, cutting off escape routes. In the mining towns of Houndé and Kaya, helicopters hovered overhead as special forces moved in. By the end of the day, more than a dozen senior executives, both foreign and local, were in custody. Seized along with them were caches of weapons, over 300 modern rifles, night vision scopes, and encrypted communication devices. Officials claimed this arsenal was evidence of a parallel power that had been allowed to grow unchecked inside the country. To the ordinary citizens, the arrests were more than legal action. They were symbolic. For decades, people whispered about how foreign companies controlled more than just mines. They controlled politicians, military officers, even the press. Yet no leader had dared to challenge them openly. Traore had done so in one night. Consider the story of Musa, a small-scale farmer from the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso. His land was swallowed by mining expansion in 2015. Promises of compensation never arrived. He now rents a plot barely enough to feed his family. On the day of the arrests, Musa joined thousands in the streets waving a torn Burkina Faso flag. He told a local journalist, "I don't know what tomorrow brings, but for the first time in my life, I feel my country belongs to us, not to them." The scale of public reaction was striking. Crowds poured into central Ouagadougou, chanting Traore's name, some holding pictures of the late Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987. Elderly men who lived through the country's turbulent coups said the moment reminded them of Sankara's promises of dignity and self-reliance. For younger generations, this was their first taste of national pride. Internationally, however, shockwaves spread quickly. Stock prices of several mining companies plunged overnight. In Paris, London, and Toronto, financial centers with stakes in West African mining, the news was treated as a corporate emergency. Reports suggested billions in potential losses if Burkina Faso nationalized its mines. The French press painted Traoré as a reckless populist. African media, on the other hand, praised him as a symbol of defiance. But beneath the celebrations and condemnation, a deeper question began to rise. What triggered this move? Analysts pointed to intelligence reports suggesting that some mining firms had been channeling funds to armed groups in the Sahel in exchange for protection. By cracking down, Traoré was not just reclaiming resources. He was cutting off financial pipelines that fueled terrorism in the region. If true, his gamble was not only about economics, but about national survival. The arrests, however, created uncertainty. Could Burkina Faso operate its mines without foreign expertise and equipment? Would foreign governments retaliate with sanctions? Would domestic elites loyal to the old order stage a countermove? These questions hung heavily in the air as the images of executives in handcuffs replayed across television screens. For many Burkina Faso families, these concerns felt distant compared to the raw emotion of seeing powerful men finally held accountable. One retired miner in Ouagadougou described how he lost his eyesight after decades in unsafe tunnels. With tears streaming, he said, "They took my sight, they took my strength, and they took my youth. Today, they cannot take my voice. Today, I have hope." The arrests were not just about gold or politics. They were about dignity, the dignity of a nation that had long been denied a fair share of its own wealth. But the move also set Burkina Faso on a collision course with forces far stronger than itself. But what caused Ibrahim Traoré to risk everything for this moment? What pushed him to take a step that could either save his country or destroy it? The climax of the crisis came not with the arrests themselves, but with what followed in the hours after. As news spread across Burkina Faso, tens of thousands filled the streets of Ouagadougou, not in fear, but in celebration. It was an extraordinary sight. Men, women, and even children waving flags, drumming, singing, and chanting the name of Ibrahim Traoré. For a country long scarred by poverty and political turmoil, this was a moment of unity, not seen in decades. At the center of this surge of emotion stood a single televised image. Ibrahim Traoré, in his military fatigues, standing behind a podium, declaring that Burkina Faso would no longer be a playground for foreign corporations. His words, simple yet powerful, carried the weight of years of frustration and anger. Elderly villagers watching on small radios in rural towns wept openly. One grandmother from the region of Ouagadougou said, "I thought I would die before seeing this day. Maybe now my grandchildren will grow up in dignity." The government's statement emphasized that the arrests were not an attack on international business, but on corruption and collusion. Yet the visuals told a different story. Powerful foreign executives, men who had once been untouchable, were now humbled before a young African leader. That image resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, social media exploded with hashtags like Nadri New Africa and Tadr Traore the Lion. Within the country, however, not all reactions were joyful. Political opponents warned that Traoré's actions would isolate Burkina Faso from critical international support. Several opposition leaders accused him of endangering the economy and predicted food shortages, inflation, and even famine if foreign investment fled. In private meetings, some military officers reportedly questioned whether Burkina Faso's army could withstand the economic and diplomatic backlash. Meanwhile, the streets told another story. Markets stayed open late into the night. Vendors gave away roasted corn and water to protesters. In the working-class district of Tampoe, thousands marched with torches, chanting, "This is our second independence." The air was filled with both celebration and uncertainty. The most emotional scene came during a massive rally in Ouagadougou's Revolution Square. Among the crowd, a mother held up a photo of her teenage son who had been killed by militants in the Sahel. Through tears, she shouted, "If this stops the money that pays for their guns, then my son did not die in vain." Her cry was met with silence, then with a roar of approval that echoed across the square. It was the kind of moment that seared itself into the national consciousness. International media scrambled to cover the unfolding drama. Western outlets described Traoré as unpredictable, while African commentators called him courageous. In Washington and Paris, diplomats held emergency briefings, trying to assess whether this was a populist stunt or the start of a long-term shift in the balance of power in West Africa. As tension grew, Traoré doubled down. He announced that Burkina Faso would audit all mining contracts signed over the past 2 decades. His voice was firm, his expression unshaken. To his supporters, this was proof of his determination. To his critics, it was reckless brinkmanship. For the ordinary people, none of that mattered as much as the feeling in their hearts. They saw a leader who spoke their pain and took action where others had hesitated. Yet even as the celebrations filled the streets, fear lurked beneath the surface. Many asked, how would the world respond? Would sanctions fall? Would foreign companies pull out entirely, taking jobs and capital with them? The climax of emotion came to a head when Traoré addressed the nation late that evening. His words were both a promise and a challenge. "We will not kneel. We will not sell our future. Burkina Faso will rise on its own terms." Those words sparked thunderous cheers in the streets, but in foreign capitals they were heard as a warning. The contrast could not be sharper. Jubilation at home, suspicion abroad. It was a night that captured the dual reality of Burkina Faso: hope and danger, pride and risk. The world was watching, and the stakes had never been higher. The celebration was loud, but beyond the cheering crowds, powerful nations were already preparing their response. The question was, would the world act in time to stop Burkina Faso's bold experiment? The immediate consequences of Traoré's decision rippled across every corner of Burkina Faso. In the days following the arrests, daily life shifted dramatically. Mining operations, once dominated by foreign companies, slowed to a near halt. Thousands of workers who depended on those jobs suddenly found themselves uncertain of their next paycheck. Families in mining towns like Houndé and Fadana worried about how they would put food on the table. For them, the arrest of executives was a powerful act of justice, but also a frightening disruption of livelihoods. Yet, even as hardship loomed, there was a sense of cautious optimism. Many citizens believed that if mines were eventually nationalized, the wealth could finally return to the people. "We have lived in poverty while our gold built palaces abroad," said a teacher in Kaya. "If we must suffer a little now, so our children can inherit a fair country, it will be worth it." His words captured the bittersweet mood that swept across much of the nation. Politically, Traoré's move consolidated his authority. Within the government and military, loyalty toward him surged. Officers who had once doubted him now rallied behind his boldness. Still, whispers of dissent lingered. Some elites who had benefited from foreign deals feared the loss of their privileges. Meetings were rumored to be taking place in secret, where business leaders and politicians discussed how to protect their interests. The potential for instability was real. Burkina Faso's history has been marked by coups and political turmoil, and the shock of these arrests revived fears of a backlash. Analysts worried about the possibility of foreign-backed attempts to destabilize the government. For older citizens, memories of past coups resurfaced, filling them with unease. The impact on ordinary people was profound, not only economically but emotionally. Families long divided by migration began to discuss the possibility of reunification. For decades, young men had left to seek work abroad, often in dangerous conditions. Now, with the hope of a new economic model, some considered returning. "If Traoré can make the mines ours, maybe my sons won't have to die in Libya or the desert," said an elderly farmer in the Sahel region. But alongside hope came fear. Food prices began to rise. In Ouagadougou's central market, vendors reported shortages of imported goods. Housewives complained that a bag of rice had nearly doubled in price within a week. Inflation threatened to spark unrest, and rumors of international sanctions only fueled anxiety. For many families, the consequences were not abstract. They were deeply personal. A young widow in Bobo Dioulasso explained how she depended on remittances from her brother, who worked as a guard at a foreign-owned mine. "Now he is home, and we have nothing," she said. "We pray this sacrifice is not in vain." Her words reflected the delicate balance between national pride and the harsh realities of daily survival. On the political stage, Traoré's image grew larger than life. Murals of his face began appearing in city streets, often painted alongside Thomas Sankara, the martyred leader who once tried to liberate Burkina Faso from foreign dependence. Supporters hailed Traoré as Sankara's spiritual heir, but critics warned that such adoration could blind the people to real dangers ahead. Civil society groups called for transparency in the process of nationalizing resources. They demanded guarantees that wealth would not simply shift from foreign corporations to corrupt officials. Religious leaders preached patience and unity, urging citizens not to let hardship divide them. In Sunday sermons across the country, pastors and imams alike asked the people to pray for wisdom, strength, and justice in this uncertain hour. The emotional toll was heavy. Families were proud, yet afraid. They dreamed of independence, yet feared hunger. The political class was energized, yet divided. The military was loyal, yet wary of foreign reprisals. Burkina Faso had entered a moment of transformation, but no one knew whether it would lead to rebirth or collapse. For the international community, these domestic consequences mattered. A destabilized Burkina Faso could trigger new refugee flows, increase poverty, and fuel radicalization. Every American watching events unfold could see how such instability might eventually affect global security. But as the people wrestled with pride and fear, and as Traoré tightened his grip on power, one question grew louder. How would the United States respond? The world did not stay silent. Within hours of the arrests, foreign capitals began issuing statements. The European Union voiced serious concern about the stability of Burkina Faso and urged respect for international contracts. France, once the colonial power, condemned the detentions outright and warned of severe consequences if French companies were not released. In contrast, several African nations cautiously praised Traoré, seeing in him a leader who dared to challenge foreign dominance. The United States faced a more complicated dilemma. Washington has long viewed Burkina Faso as a critical player in the fight against extremist groups in the Sahel. American intelligence reports have linked terrorist financing networks to smuggling operations that sometimes overlap with mining routes. If Traoré was truly disrupting those flows, his actions could align with U.S. security interests. But the manner of his crackdown, arrests of foreign nationals, seizure of corporate assets, and talk of nationalization raised alarm about economic stability. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials debated. Some argued that supporting Traoré could strengthen counter-terrorism efforts in the region. Others feared that his anti-Western rhetoric might push Burkina Faso closer to Russia or other rivals, undermining U.S. influence in Africa. American media reflected this divide, with some outlets portraying Traoré as a bold reformer and others branding him a populist threat. Ordinary Americans, particularly those with memories of the Cold War, could see echoes of past struggles. A small nation standing up against global giants evoked both admiration and concern. Veterans of military service asked whether Burkina Faso's turmoil might create another front for U.S. troops. Retired diplomats warned that instability in the Sahel could spread across borders, threatening allies like Niger and Mali. Globally, markets reacted with volatility. Gold prices spiked as investors worried about supply chains. Mining companies in Canada and Australia issued urgent warnings to shareholders. In Moscow, state media praised Traoré as a leader who resisted Western pressure. In Beijing, analysts noted the potential for China to expand its influence by offering new partnerships. The geopolitical chessboard was shifting quickly, and Burkina Faso was suddenly at its center. For Washington, the stakes were clear. Burkina Faso's stability was tied not just to African security, but to America's broader strategy of preventing extremist groups from gaining safe havens. If the country descended into chaos, the Sahel could become a breeding ground for terrorism, with direct consequences for U.S. national security. At the same time, ignoring the popular support behind Traoré risked alienating millions of Africans who saw him as a symbol of justice. The challenge for U.S. policymakers was to decide, engage with Traoré as a partner or oppose him as a threat. Either choice carried risks. Engagement might legitimize his crackdown, but open doors for cooperation. Opposition might protect corporate interests, but drive Burkina Faso into the arms of America's rivals. As Washington weighed its options, the world began to wonder, was this the beginning of a larger crisis in Africa that could reshape global alliances? The events in Burkina Faso are more than a national drama. They are a warning to the entire Sahel and beyond. When a leader dares to confront decades of exploitation, the ripple effects cannot be contained within borders. Already, whispers of unrest are spreading into neighboring Mali and Niger. Analysts warn that if instability grows unchecked, the entire Sahel could spiral into deeper conflict. Terrorist groups, smugglers, and foreign powers alike would exploit the chaos. For the United States, this means a direct challenge to its national security interests. And so we return to the fundamental question: is Ibrahim Traoré the hope of a new Africa, or a dangerous spark that may ignite wider turmoil? His supporters call him a liberator, the man who finally reclaimed Burkina Faso's dignity. His critics call him reckless, a young officer who may gamble away his nation's fragile future. History will not answer quickly, but what is clear today is that Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads between independence and isolation, between rebirth and ruin. The risks are enormous, Sanctions could cripple the economy. Foreign investment may flee. The military might fracture if outside pressures intensify. Families already living on the edge may sink deeper into poverty. Yet, there is also a chance, small but real, that Burkina Faso could emerge stronger, with resources finally directed to its people rather than siphoned abroad. That possibility explains the pride that has surged through its streets, even as hardship looms. Imagine a scenario 3 months from now. If African nations unite to form a protective economic and military alliance, Burkina Faso might survive the storm and inspire others. But if that unity fails, Traore could find himself isolated, facing both external pressure and internal dissent. The next 90 days may well determine the fate of his government and perhaps the future of the Sahel itself. For older Americans watching this unfold, the story may feel familiar. It echoes the Cold War, when small nations became battlegrounds for larger powers. It raises the same questions of justice, freedom, and the price of independence. And it forces us to reflect. How should the world respond when a people demand dignity, even at great risk? The truth is simple yet hard. The world cannot ignore Burkina Faso. What happens there will shape Africa's path in the 21st century. And it will affect America's own security, because instability in the Sahel does not remain distant. It travels in the form of migration, terrorism, and economic shocks. So we ask you, the viewer, what do you believe? Is Ibrahim Traoré the leader Africa has been waiting for? Or a gambler who may cost his people dearly? Will this be remembered as the night Burkina Faso stood tall, or the moment it stepped into the storm? If this story has touched your heart, do not stay silent. Think about the families who lost their sons in the mines, the mothers who fear for their children's future, and the soldiers who now stand ready to defend their land. Reflect on what justice and dignity mean, not just for Africa, but for all of us. And if you believe that truth matters, that justice matters, and that the dignity of a people must never be sold, then let this story live in you. Share it in your conversations, reflect on it in your prayers, and carry it as a reminder that freedom is never given. It is always fought for. We will meet again in the next story, where the struggle for truth continues. May God bless Burkina Faso, may He bless Africa, and may He bless all those who still believe in justice, dignity, and the unbreakable will of a people who refuse to kneel. The world is watching. The next move belongs to history.